Our next speaker is Lindsay Marin, and she's going to be talking about technology and training. And hopefully we'll be able to resolve this technological problem. But she can get started at the beginning anyway.
Bonjour, Jayek. So, of course, during the presentation on tech is, of course, when we run into technical difficulties, and I guess that's kind of the way it goes. So I just want to say a little bit about me. So I have my master's degree in linguistics from University of Oregon. Right before I started grad school is when I first started really getting serious about learning Potawatomi language. So, of course, learning Potawatomi is the thing that I want more than about anything. So at this time, I have 2 different jobs. I work as a part-time linguist for a tribe in California, the Tabatalabal tribe. And then I also have a part-time job working at the University of Oregon for the Center for Applied Second Language Studies, which is about language teaching. Pardon? Oh, yeah, because I need to look at my notes, and I don't know how to do. When I did Presenter View, it had Presenter View on my laptop as well. So I just want to go through my introduction, and then I'll do Presenter View. That I have to look at this one piece. I have that second part-time job at the University of Oregon, and then until recently, until May, during the last 6 years, I was part of a DEL-funded project. Monica was our PI. We spent the first 3 years publishing a Potawatomi dictionary, which was awesome to have that done. And then we spent the second 3 years just recording our fluent speakers talking to each other, and then transcribing and translating as many of those recordings as we could. So I'm a very grateful beneficiary of DEL funding. I am also, I guess that is all the notes I have. The other piece that I want to say is when I got serious about learning Potawatomi, one of the things I did was I participated in the Anishinaabemowin program, which is offered through Bay Mills Community College, and this is an adult immersion program where now I can do that. This is an adult immersion program where fluent speakers basically spend an entire day from early in the morning until late at night just talking Anishinaabemowin to us, and we listen. But they're trained in immersion techniques, and so they act out what they're telling us. They draw pictures. They're constantly asking comprehension check questions to make sure we get it. And being a part of that program really was my first big breakthrough in starting to learn Potawatomi. So I'm also a very fortunate beneficiary of that community college program. I have also been in several different COLANGs. So COLANG is a collaborative institute in basically language documentation fieldwork methods. Before I start, I want to geek out a little bit because I'm a linguist and I also love indigenous languages, and I can't help but talk about this. I work part-time for members of the Tabatalabal tribe as their practical linguist. Tabatalabal is what other people call Tabatalabal people. The Tabatalabal tribe is east of Bakersfield, kind of at the southern end of the Sierra Nevada where it peters out in California. Tabatalabal people call themselves Pakka. So that's the name of Tabatalabal people in Pakka Amil. Pakka Amil is the name of their language. Pakka and Pakka Amil both come from the same kind of root verb, Pakka Anat, which means he or she is speaking their language, Pakka Amil. That T at the end, that AT at the end of that, is just a present tense suffix, so it's saying he or she is speaking. So if you take that off, you end up with just this root word, Pakka An, which just means speak Pakka Amil. If you add this Apul part up here, which is the name that people who belong to this tribe call themselves, that basically turns this verb into a noun, people who do the action of that verb. So Pakka Anapul literally means a person who speaks the Pakka language. So the people that I work for in California, their name for themselves is literally the people who speak the Pakka Amil language. So every time I find little things like this where language is such an integral part of identity, it makes me feel really good because I love languages. I want to say a little bit of the same sort of thing about Anishinaabemowin. So Anishinaabemowin is Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe. There's this word, Gadinwe Magananik, our relatives, all of our relatives. And if you take off what are called the inflectional morphemes, so the thing that makes it more than one relative, and the little pieces in the front and back here that make it our, you end up with just this piece here that's the part that really means relative. If you take that and you break it apart even more, you end up with, these are called derivational morphemes. This one changes it into a verb. It means to do this thing like someone else. And this makes it into a noun, a person who does this like someone else. So we get down to this root thing here, nwa, sound a certain way. So that's used for words like nwewan, language. So what this really means, Gadinwe Magananik, is the people who sound like us, the people who speak the same language that we do. So if you look at what all of our relatives really means to Anishinaabe people, those are the people who speak the same language that I do, that we do, that sound like we do. So that's just another time when I see language really relating to identity, and the evidence for that way of thinking is embedded in the language itself. So I just had to geek out on that briefly before I jump in. This talk, my piece is going to deal with technology tools, kind of what a workflow for language revitalization can look like. So the sorts of things a person might want to learn to document language. I have to say, we've had these discussions all day long about where does documentation really fit with language revitalization? And I think probably to me the clearest thing that was said today was what George said, that language revitalization is creating new speakers, and then the documentation is nice, so we have this stuff we can set on the shelf for later if we need it. I would argue that we can use that stuff from the shelf as part of our revitalization efforts. I know that I learned tremendously from the things that we're doing with documentation, but I'm going to start with the documentation piece. So first, a little bit of history. It used to be back in the time period that Wes was talking about this morning, when anthropologists started really becoming interested in languages of North America, linguists started feeling like language documentation basically means creating three things: a descriptive grammar, telling how you put things together into sentences and so on, a dictionary, and a text collection. So these three things, the language I work on in California, Pakka Amil, this is the grammar that was written in 1935. So somehow, magically, everything about putting the language is in these 140 pages. Anyway, box checked. Dictionary. So, and actually, I'm going to show you a little piece of a page from that instead of just waving a book around. So this is a page out of that descriptive grammar. It was written by Charles Vogel in 1935. And here's some really nice explanatory language. A subordinate verb formed by the suffix ash is used in two different senses, which are not always clearly distinguished. In the first sense, the subordinate verb is an infinitive, and this sense is always used after the main verb, to know, but sometimes after other main verbs. Clears it right up, right? One of the issues with descriptive grammars like these is it's really hard to make any sense of them if you're not a linguist. And even if you are a linguist, you kind of have to study on how linguistics was done in the 1930s to make sense out of this. Another piece out of it is he gives a couple of examples there, and then that's it. Then we just kind of have to take his word for it. That's all we get in terms of how do fluent speakers actually do subordination in this language. So the second piece is the dictionary. This is Charles Vogelin's word list that he had typed up from his field note cards. Actually, this much is his word list. It's pretty thin. And this is an example of it. And you can see a spelling system that does not look quite easy to use from the get-go. It's hard to know what these half question marks are. They're glottal stops. This long dot means you have to stretch out that vowel a little bit longer. These Z's with dots underneath them, you have to read over here to learn that those actually make a Z sound, and if it's a hooky dot, then it's a J sound, and so on. But so that's a dictionary. Check that one off the box of the trilogy. And then the last piece is a text collection. Now, the text collections, to me, are the most exciting part because this is actual fluent speakers using language to communicate something. This is how much he collected. So this is what we have from the 1930s of actual speakers using language. We don't have any recordings associated with this. All we have is the printed word written in this particular spelling system. And we know something about the context of this. The researcher, Vogel, sat down with a couple of fluent speakers and said, tell me stories, but stop after every sentence because I have to write this, I have to transcribe this. So you can imagine that the speakers probably felt a little bit uncomfortable as they were telling these stories. It's not your everyday kind of language use situation, but that's what we have. So that's kind of the history of language documentation and what it used to mean. And often I think we still kind of get in that mindset of, oh, language documentation, we need a grammar, we need a dictionary, we need texts. That's kind of the fallback of linguists. However, the definition of language documentation has been changing over the last 25 years. So Himmelman is the person who started really emphasizing the importance of basically primary materials. So something like these text collections, but since we live in a new century, now we can have recordings instead of just somebody's transcription. So as laid out in Himmelman's work, a language documentation includes a lot more than just dictionary, grammar, text collection. So I'm going to just talk through kind of what those components are. One, a collection of spoken texts. This morning, Wes and Monica said that linguists really like to focus on spoken language as opposed to written, and that's still a part of Himmelman's definition. A variety of genres. So in the 1930s, anthropologists really liked to collect, for example, creation stories. That's wonderful. We have this entire collection of texts in Tabatatabal. We do not know how to ask a yes-no question about someone who's not there. So I know how to ask, are you hungry? Am I hungry? Which, why would you ever ask that? We never learned how to ask, is your mother hungry? It's not, and it's not in the grammar. It's just kind of this little missing piece. And somehow like, oh, is your mom feeling better? Or, oh, is your baby hungry? Those are everyday conversation, but they don't show up a whole lot in creation stories. So now we know that we need a wider variety of genres. We need stories, but we need a lot of different kinds of stories. We need everyday conversations between people sitting face to face so they have an audience. We need people actually negotiating something. They have to use language to communicate. We need people giving instructions. We need songs. We need all kinds of different things. So variety of genres. Recorded on audio or video, especially now that we can record digitally, there's no reason not to do this. And then the next piece, time-aligned annotations. How many people in here have some tapes or CDs sitting around from someone speaking in their indigenous language, nonstop, sitting on a shelf somewhere? Monica's holding her head in the back of the room. Oh, the first time that one of these tapes, one of these recordings in Potawatomi came my way, I was just like, oh, this is it. I get to just listen to Potawatomi, and I did. And I couldn't understand. I didn't even know where one word ended and the next word began. Those recordings are gold. But as a learner, there's no toehold to even get your way into it. So it's really important to move on to the next step, which is to go back through and laboriously write out what's being said, to make sure with the elders that that is actually what they said, that it's spelled correctly, that you didn't mishear or they didn't misspeak, and then what does that actually mean? what's called a free translation in English, just in plain English. The next piece is metadata. Well, I guess kind of an optional piece for some, but not all of the recordings, is to go ahead and break that down further. So if you have a long word like Gdinwe Magnanik, all our relatives, to break that into the little pieces so that people can see kind of how it fits together. Metadata is data about data. The last thing we want is recordings and we have no idea who's talking or where they're talking or what they're talking about or why this happened or if you were ever even intended to have this recording. So metadata is really important. Information about who's on the recording, why they're recording this, who should have access to this, what are they talking about, who else is in the room. That's the primary material now that we think of as the core of language documentation. And then the other pieces might be things that you ask directly for from a fluent speaker. So those might be word lists to maybe target some areas that might not come out in everyday speech. Maybe you really want to study the names of all the birds, and you're going to miss a couple unless you just flat out ask all of those. Maybe there are some grammatical points that you really want to make sure you know how to do this particular thing, and so you want to ask a couple of direct questions to fill in those gaps. Maybe you need some information about how this is situated culturally with everything else about a people's life. And then the last component of language documentation is an archive. After doing all of this work, actually before you do any of this work, you should have a clear idea of where your documentation materials are going to end up, how they're going to be kept safe and secure on into future generations, who should have access to them, how that's going to be managed. How many people have had this treasured cassette tape with fluent speech in their indigenous language, and you go to pull it out, and the tape has turned into goo. So having an archiving plan is really, really important to make sure that that doesn't happen. So this chart is kind of too much information, but what I want to really point out is that the primary data is these recordings of people using language. And everything else can kind of be pulled off of that primary data. So that's where the focus of language documentation is nowadays. From the primary data, you can pull out a lot of words to build a dictionary. From the primary recordings, you can figure out a lot about how things fit together into sentences and you can write a grammar. But you can't go the other way around. You can't use a dictionary and a descriptive grammar and build how people really talk when they're face-to-face with each other and have something to communicate. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is run through kind of a step-by-step of how would you really do this in real life? And I'm really fortunate because our second DEL grant was doing exactly this kind of work. I got to sit down with my elders, turn on a video recorder and an audio recorder, record them, and then we would go back through, review these transcripts, and so on. Step number one, before you even start recording, figure out your archiving plan. Where are these recordings going to go? The recordings that I want to play for you guys, I would have no idea whether it was okay with my elders to play it for you guys in this room if I hadn't asked them. And I asked them before they started, and then I asked them again when they were finished recording that day, and then I asked them again after we reviewed the transcript and they had seen everything that they had said. So that gives me the peace of mind of knowing what stays with tribal members only, what's okay for more public dissemination, what things after they recorded they were like, you know what, I don't think you should even archive this. So that needs to be upfront. And then making sure you have the archiving plan so you're not going to lose these. Step two, record. And as I go through these steps, part of why I think we want to go through these is to think about, in a university program, in a college program, are these skills that can be taught in a program so that people can be trained to do hands-on language documentation, hands-on field work. So training people on how to do quality audio and video recordings is important. And as you'll see, if I can get my video to play, Audio worked out okay with me. I am not a videographer. I could have benefited from that training myself. Next phase, after you've recorded it, is to go through and laboriously write out what the people are saying. It's hard to do any other kind of analysis if you don't have it written out in some way that computers can process and that people can process visually. And then translate that into rough English equivalents, which often is completely backwards from the way it was said in the original language. From there, you can analyze the transcripts and you can create a lexical database, which becomes a collection of words that can become a dictionary. In the process, you'll also be figuring out how the grammar works, how you put words together, how you put sentences together. You'll come across all of those little pieces that are so hard to put a meaning to. And then finally, archive those and make them available to the language community so that hopefully it's not just sitting on a shelf, but people right here, right now can learn from these materials. So we'll start with the recording, maybe. This is my elder, Jim Thunder, who's Forest County Potawatomi, who has been just an absolute language is what he does and has been for decades and decades. And this is the late Lillian Rice, who participated in our project just for a couple of years, but is an amazing speaker as well, was an amazing speaker and woman. So we'll see if this will play. And the answer is no. Darn it. So, shucks. You guys don't get to hear them. I'm very sorry. But what they're talking about in this particular case was I asked each person to talk about their experience with school. And so Jim and Lillian actually did not grow up near each other. They actually don't know each other very well at all. So everything that Jim was saying about his educational experience was news to Lillian as well. And it was awesome having Lillian there because even though it was mostly just Jim saying, well, this is where I started school, this is what happened next, it was wonderful to have somebody else say, oh, which is mostly what she said. So that's step one. If I was putting together a language documentation program, I would definitely include a piece on videography because this is not an ideal framing. But that's what we have. So that's step one. Step two, right away record your metadata. So on this one, I know that I have a label that also corresponds to all of the audio files. I had an audio recorder and a video recorder running at the same time. So the audio file, the video file, if there were multiple cameras at multiple angles, I would have those. And then eventually my transcript file, all of those kind of line up together and correspond to this particular episode file name. And then I have a nickname so I can remember. This was Jim's school narrative. Everybody who was present that day and what their roles were. So Jim was there, Lillian was there, I was there, and then another language department worker was there when we did the review, making sure the transcript was correct, which it never is. So correcting the transcript. Those are the people who were present that day. So that's the metadata. This particular metadata structure is something that we built in-house as part of our project. But it's basically just a database. Okay, next piece, transcription. So this is where I had to go back through the recording, and I really wish I could play the sound for you guys. I had to go back through the recording and laboriously type out each piece. And this is the program that I used to do that. So the first thing that I did, actually, the first thing that I did was I played the entire recording, and every time that Jim spoke, I would kind of bracket it. Here's where he started speaking, here's where he stopped speaking. Here's where he started again, here's where he stopped. And then every time Lillian spoke, same thing, where she stopped, where she started. If they happen to speak at the same time, then I could indicate that. Although something I learned about my elders is that never happens. They never cut each other off. Once I had broken this into segments, I hadn't typed any of these words in yet. Then I went to the transcription mode. And if I click on one of these... Well, what?
I think it's something to do with whatever application your other videos are in.
Well, shoot, that's awesome. Okay. Yes, well, great. So I can show you guys a little bit more. So basically, if I am playing this piece of the video, okay, so up until here, I've done the segmentation.
Kineta. Oasis naging just webs kono.
So what I just did there was I just hit the enter key to bracket what Jim said. Oops, except I accidentally had it as Lillian, so let me go down and bracket that as Jim speaking. And then right here, Lillian was speaking, so I'm going to go and bracket her saying, oh, and then go back down to the next thing Jim says. So what I went through is I just made the little segments. Then when I go into transcription mode, I can play over and over as many times as I need Jim saying that line. If he's talking too fast for me, I can slow him down. And when I'm good and ready, then I can type that in. Whoops. So all I'm doing is I'm just typing in what I hear him saying. I play it over and over as many times as I need, and then the rough English to go with it. So that's that piece. And then Lillian says, oh. Oh.
Oh.
Oh. Okay, so that's all I'm doing. I'm just going through transcribing what he's saying. Yeah, question?
How did you get the one on the right-hand side?
I had to set that up ahead of time. So ahead of time, I decided that for this recording, I wanted to have one column that was what he's saying in Potawatomi, and then the facing column would be to English. There have been times where I've set up an extra column because we have writing system wars. And so sometimes people have wanted to see the same thing but spelled several different ways. And so in that case, I can set up an additional column here in this setup box and then add that in. So I can actually have as many columns as I want.
So when you enter it, they are automatically places it under the dialogue box on the other side, correct?
Yes.
I could go place it.
Exactly. So if I go back to that segmentation mode, remember I kind of skipped a couple blanks, but there it is in the segmentation mode. And there's another one that is, oh no, that's not it. Over here, if I just play the video, you'll kind of see it scroll along down here in the bottom. And so
Zi MBI gi George tunawaji skon gamak.
Oh,
Shaek na Nishnabeki awiki skon ochuk.
So it just kind of, you see the transcript going right along with the video. And so that's the power of a time-aligned annotation. I can also jump to a particular part that I want to hear. I actually prefer it in transcription mode. But I can jump to a particular line.
msen. Chona msen, giyosinawa.
And jump right to that place. So if I want to hear something pronounced again, I can just jump right there. So that's Elan.
And that works vice versa if I put it on the other side, correct? If I type it out on the other side, it'll automatically insert it here?
Yes. It's a wonderful program. It's free. And it also plays well with it's based on what's called an XML format, which means it's more or less easy to import and export into other tools. So that's that piece. That's the translation and transcription. I can also tell you that for 5 minutes of Jim talking, it's going to take me about an hour to type it out. If I was a better speaker, maybe I'd be a little bit faster, but transcription always just takes a lot of time. The next piece is the analysis. So one example of a piece of analysis, an analysis application is this one that's called Flex Tool. And basically this would be taking my transcript from Elan, importing it into this tool, Flex Tool, and in this tool, I can give kind of a rough gloss of what this means. Megwem Tugwakik is the thing I just typed in there in the middle of the woods. And then in a lot of cases, if I click that something is correct one time, so here's the word eji over there, I can click that this, and see down here we have eji too, but it's not sure if that's the right translation. If I click on this, yes, you can approve it throughout the text. Then look, now it's approved it everywhere where he uses that word. So basically I can go into this application and kind of break down word for word what each piece means. And I can even get a lot more in depth. So I can also break this up into, oh, come on. If this was a different word that didn't have an accented E, then I could easily type like the megwa, and it would break that down to meaning in the midst of something. And then it would take this piece, mtigwak, mtigwak k, as meaning forest, and then it would take that K at the end for like located in. So that's kind of how that breaks down. So anyway, that's the next piece. If I want to, I can break it down into all the different pieces. By labeling these words, it adds it all into what's called a lexical database. And so basically over here, based on going through and chunking up words like that, I build up basically the roots of a dictionary with all the different words that I've come across and all the different texts that I've gone through. And so that's a way that having that primary recording ends up building up your dictionary database and also gets me really thinking about what do all those different word pieces mean. So that's the next piece, analysis. The final piece is presentation. So Elan is really nice, kind of, in that I can play the video, I can jump to different places in it. But it's not really the most learner-friendly. Like if I wanted to teach a language class and I wanted to start off by saying, okay, first I want you guys to listen to this conversation about school experiences. Using Elan to present something in like a community teaching setting isn't the best. So there are other programs that will take something from Elan and turn it into a more community-friendly format. Unfortunately, like I said, for the Tech Talk, of course, we have technical difficulties. I couldn't get it to do it for this particular thing, so instead I'm going to show you someone else's awesome work, and this is the Passamaquoddy Maliseet portal. Here. So I had nothing to do with this website. I just happen to think it's awesome because this is a website for Passamaquoddy Maliseet where you can look at videos, primary material, that have been recorded by different people. And eventually the video will load. You can either play straight through the video, or you can jump down to
Det blir en nilon, ja, internet. Das kunde giskakimin good.
any place within that recording. But this is a way more community-friendly format. This is on a website that anybody can access. The website also includes a dictionary. Where you see a link to here, it will usually take someone to that particular dictionary entry. And so it's a really great learner tool. So once you've created the primary documentation, I just also wanted to show you don't want to necessarily just stick it on a shelf. You can pretty easily right away put it into a format so other people can be learning from these recordings. So that's that piece. Okay, so all of these tech tools, the next thing I wanted to go over was just very briefly, where can people learn how to do this? I should say that I've been told that all of these PowerPoint presentations are going to be available on the LSA website. So right now I'm just going to throw web links at you guys. And later on, you can go back, access this PowerPoint, and for each link, you can find out more about each of these opportunities. So CoLang, people keep talking about. This is the Institute on Collaborative Language Research. It happens in even-numbered years. So there was one in Alaska this last summer, and the next one will be in Florida in 2018. It alternates with the LSA Linguistic Institute, which is a lot more linguisty. CoLang really is designed for community language activists to learn how to do hands-on language documentation. LSA is really more for people who really want to learn linguistics, and that happens on the odd years. So it's going to happen at the University of Kentucky in this coming summer. ALDI, the American Indian Language Development Institute, happens every summer, has been happening for, gosh, decades. It's an intensive, long summer institute where you can learn linguistics, but you can also learn teaching methods, immersion methods, all kinds of different things. NELI, the Northwest Indian Language Institute, is somewhat patterned after ALDI, but it is a lot shorter. And it's put on by the University of Oregon each year. Breath of Life, several people have mentioned. The original Breath of Life is put on by the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. It's held in even years at Berkeley. It's held in odd years in Washington, D.C. There are also now spin-off Breaths of Lives. One of them in Oklahoma. There's going to be one at the University of British Columbia, I just found out. Basically, in the Breath of Life Institutes, community language activists are paired with a linguist, and then you dig into archives. And you find archival information about your language, which isn't necessarily that easy to make sense out of. It looks a lot like that passage that I read from Vogel's grammar, but you have a linguist with you to help make sense out of the writing system, what all of this means, and how you can turn this into actual learning materials. So that's Breath of Life. One of my favorite listservs, Indigenous Language and Technology. It's moderated by Phil Kashkash. And it's a great forum to just flat out ask questions. If you just want a nice application for transcribing things and you can't remember about Elan, you can always just go on to ILAT and ask the community, and somebody will give you the answer. So it's a great resource just in general for, I have a tech question, and often the questions aren't even techie. They're just, I have this issue in my community around my language. What can I do? And it's a really great, helpful community. So that's where people can learn how to do techie things like this. The applications that I've shown, I just wanted to put some links up here so that if you go back and access the presentation later, you can. Elan, that transcription application, is right here. Flex tool for breaking it down is right here. Flex isn't the only tool that's like that. Toolbox does something very similar, but it's old and people don't usually use the older program when they can use the newer thing. Miramar is another example of a program that does the same sort of thing. The portal that I showed you guys, the organization that created that portal and has created a couple others since then is Language Keepers, and you can learn more about them and contact them if you want to build something similar. And then finally up here, these are just some standards for metadata. What sorts of information you should record. So again, all of this will be, you can access the PowerPoint and those links will all be there, but I didn't want to just leave you hanging and show you the cool computer program and then close the laptop and walk away. So that was language documentation. As I was preparing the presentation, I felt bad just talking about that because language documentation is not the same thing as language revitalization. And I think that's become very clear in all of our conversations today. So I'm going to kind of jump around and touch on, because I have the podium, just some of my thoughts on language revitalization. So people talk about language revitalization. Language reclamation was the word that Wes used. Since the early 1990s, we've also talked about reversing language shift. So people have shifted from using indigenous languages to, in our case, English. How can you reverse that so that people start using their indigenous languages instead? Joshua Fishman came up with what he calls a graded intergenerational disruption scale. One of the questions this morning was, how do I know if what's working for my people is going to be good advice for someone else? Because with the Dene, you have all kinds of people who can still speak. With Potawatomi, we have fewer than a dozen. So how do I know that what's working for me is going to work for you? In Fishman's presentation, basically, he focuses on, first of all, is the language being passed on to the next generation at home? If it is, then your language is at least kind of stable. If it's not, your language is not stable. So the higher you are up here, the less stable your language is. What you should do is going to be dependent on the status of your particular language. This is Fishman's thinking. So if you're at a place where there are so fewer speakers left that pretty much no one even speaks your language anymore, the community norms are to use English, tribal council meetings are in English, everything is English, then he says, document for future reconstruction so that you have this emergency stuff on the shelf, and work on adult language acquisition. So that's where you run into programs like the Master Apprentice program that's already been discussed. If you were in Jacob's presentation where he talked about the team Master Apprentice immersion approach, that's a really awesome one. The Anishinaabemowin Pene program that I got to participate in is another example of adult immersion camp experiences. That's an approach to building new adult fluent speakers. You need that because you need to have these younger adults who can then work on restoring the transmission to younger people and to children and eventually get the language back into the home. So if you still have a lot of people who are older that are using the language, but children are not learning it, that's when you would start working on really mobilizing the community. And especially people who are still of child-raising age, really mobilizing people to raise children in their own indigenous language. Where you have language being passed on to children in the home, that's where you can start thinking about immersion schools in a really effective sort of way. It's really hard to do immersion schools if you don't have the young adults who can be the teachers. And that's something that's kind of come up also today in conversations. So immersion schools, however, are awesome. And Monica's already talked about funding through the Esther Martinez program with the ANA. Again, a major hurdle to creating an immersion program is you need those credentialed teachers who can also speak proficiently, confidently, and that's hard. And that's one area where I think tribal colleges and universities can fill in a really kind of gaping hole in all of this. So Where can people learn more? I already put up all those training opportunities, but I also want to point out that Indigenous language organizations are not the only organizations that have information about language learning. So you can also, Carla, for example, is a national center that's based at the University of Minnesota that puts on training for language teachers of all kinds of languages every summer, including immersion methods for Indigenous language teachers. So it's kind of an overlap between people who are teaching Spanish and French and whatever and Indigenous languages and finding where there's overlap in pedagogy. Some state organizations, New Mexico Association for Bilingual Education includes concerns for teaching Indigenous languages. Bilingual education doesn't just mean English and Spanish. Jacob mentioned the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. These are the people that teach Spanish and French teachers how to teach Spanish and French. I should point out that any community has inertia. There are still plenty of Spanish and French teachers teaching verb charts and vocab lists, and that doesn't work any better for Spanish and French than it does for our Indigenous languages. What ACTFL is pushing for now is something that's a lot more oriented towards what you really can do with language. So this is an ACTFL product that is an assessment tool. If you want to figure out where someone's language proficiency is, this is a novice high level of interpersonal communication, which is face-to-face communication, and there's nothing in there with verb charts or syntax or morphology. These are all things you can do. I can invite and make plans with someone to do something or go somewhere. I can accept or reject an invitation to go somewhere. I can exchange information about where to go. So ACTFL also is pushing in this direction of languages for using. So we can learn from these other organizations that aren't really targeted at Indigenous language teachers, but are still have some really useful tools. Very quickly, there's also room for language revitalization just as its own field of study. So language revitalization has its own conferences. Here are some links to some that are coming up very soon. This one is in Hawaii next month, and I've never been, but I hear it's awesome. Language revitalization has its own journal. So Language Documentation and Conservation is a peer-reviewed but open access journal. So if you want to see kind of what's going on in the field, what may or may not be working in different communities, what new tools are out there for language documentation, it's a great journal to check out, and it's free. Its own funding, which has already been talked about extensively, and I'm going to leave it at that because I'm out of time. Thanks, everybody. That's it.